The cameras stopped rolling. The studio audience went home. The applause faded into silence. And then what? Today, we are examining 10 British entertainment figures whose deaths between 1972 and 1983 shocked the nation and changed the industry permanently. From the queen of British sitcom comedy who drank herself to death at 53 to a Liverpool rock and roll king whose passing took his mother with him, to the man who built Led Zeppelin's sound with his bare hands and died from a very human fragility in a guest bedroom in Windsor. Stay until the end, because the final story on this list is the one that will genuinely break you. Not because of how it ended, but because of how close it came to not ending at all. Welcome back to Golden Age Bytes, the channel that goes behind the official record, past the studio portraits and the press releases, and tells you what actually happened. These are the facts. These are their stories. And this is Golden Age Bytes. At number 1 is Eutha Joyce. When we examine the golden age of British television comedy in the 1970s, few faces remain as instantly recognizable as that of Eutha Joyce. With her distinctive features and exceptional comic timing, she became a household name through her portrayal of Mildred Roper in Man About the House and its enormously successful spin off George and Mildred. On screen, she played a sexually frustrated, perpetually dissatisfied wife who bickered endlessly with her work-shy husband, a character that resonated with millions of viewers and transformed her into one of the highest-paid actresses working in British television. Her catchphrases echoed in schoolyards and workplaces across the country. To the viewing public, she projected an image of immense confidence, resilience, and comic authority. The reality could not have been further from that public persona. Eutha Joyce was, by nature, an intensely private and deeply shy individual who never felt genuinely comfortable in the spotlight. Despite her fame, she harbored persistent insecurities about her appearance, a quiet and corrosive belief that she was not attractive enough to be truly loved. Following a painful divorce in the late 1960s, she found herself returning night after night to an empty house. The silence that greeted her after the studio audience's applause had faded became, by all accounts, deafening. To cope with that crushing loneliness and with the relentless pressure of maintaining her public image, she began to rely heavily on alcohol. What began as a social habit, manageable and unremarkable, gradually became a dangerous daily necessity, a method of numbing a quiet despair that plagued her evenings and had no obvious remedy. Throughout the 1970s, as her fame grew exponentially, so did her dependence. Colleagues on set began to notice the warning signs. She would sip regularly from a glass of brandy, which she claimed was ginger ale, a polite fiction that those around her accepted, perhaps because they love her too much to intervene or because she remained, despite everything, a consummate professional when the cameras were rolling. She never missed a line, never missed a cue, and continued to deliver performances of real comedic precision even as her body was quietly failing. Joyce became known as the life and soul of every social gathering, always buying rounds, always the last to leave, always the one filling the silence. The heartbreaking paradox at the center of her life was this. The woman who brought joy into 20 million homes was arguably the loneliest person in the entire industry. By the summer of 1980, her health collapsed. She was filming the feature film version of George and Mildred when she was admitted to hospital. Her co-star and close friend, Brian Murphy, who played her on-screen husband for years, rushed to her bedside and was visibly shaken by what he found. The vibrant energy was entirely gone, replaced by the yellowing pallor of severe organ failure. Eutha Joyce passed away on the 24th of August, 1980, at the age of 53. The cause of death was liver failure brought on by years of sustained heavy alcohol consumption. The public had no idea that their beloved Mildred had been suffering in this way. The shock that followed her death was genuine and widespread. She had given her audience everything she had, every ounce of warmth and energy and comedic brilliance, and left nothing whatsoever for herself. At number 2 is Rachel Roberts. If Eutha Joyce was the queen of comedy who hid her pain behind laughter, Rachel Roberts was the queen of drama who wore her heart openly and paid for it entirely. Born in Wales, Roberts was an actress of ferocious intensity and raw, uncommon talent. Celebrated for her work in the gritty kitchen sink dramas of the early 1960s, most notably Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, she was the toast of the acting world, the recipient of multiple BAFTA awards, and a figure who commanded the screen with an energy that very few of her contemporaries could match. However, her professional success was permanently overshadowed by her turbulent personal life and, specifically, by her marriage to the Hollywood legend Rex Harrison. To Rachel, Rex was not merely a husband. He was the gravitational center of her entire existence. When they were together, they were the golden couple of the international theater world. When that union collapsed, finalized in 1971, Rachel's world shattered in ways that time could not repair. She moved to Los Angeles, attempting to restart her career and, by various accounts, hoping still to win Rex back. She continued to work, delivering powerful performances in Picnic at Hanging Rock and Murder on the Orient Express. But behind the scenes, her behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. She became known for making desperate telephone calls to her former husband at all hours. She was prone to public outbursts. Friends who loved her were forced to watch a brilliant woman reduce herself to a shadow in pursuit of a love that had been legally and emotionally closed for nearly a decade. By late 1980, nearly 9 years after the divorce, the desperation had reached its final point. She had convinced herself that the romance could be rekindled despite Rex being long remarried. On the 26th of November, 1980, she made a final attempt to reach him. The rejection was absolute. Alone in her Los Angeles home, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of a past she could not release, Rachel Roberts, aged 53, made the decision to end her life. She left behind a journal entry detailing her anguish in full. Her end was violent and chaotic. She was found by her gardener the following morning. She was a woman of extraordinary creative gifts who had placed the entirety of her self-worth in another person. When that person was definitively removed from the equation, she could not locate herself without him. Her films remain testament to her genius. Her life remains a devastating examination of what obsession can do to even the most formidable of people. And number 3 is Graham Bond. Graham Bond is cited by music historians as one of the founding architects of the British rhythm and blues explosion of the 1960s. A virtuoso organist and saxophonist, he ran the legendary Graham Bond Organization, a band that functioned, in retrospect, as a breeding ground for future superstars. It was Graham who discovered and mentored Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker before they departed to form Cream and became millionaires. In the mid-1960s, Graham was a genuine force in London's underground scene, respected, financially comfortable, and creatively uncontainable. What followed was a descent of truly frightening speed and completeness. His downfall was driven by a combination of undiagnosed mental instability and a severe addiction to heavy illegal substances. As the decade turned, his behavior became erratic in ways that went far beyond eccentricity. He developed a profound obsession with the occult and black magic, genuinely believing himself to be the illegitimate son of Aleister Crowley. He conducted bizarre rituals on stage. He claimed to be cursed. He drove away friends and potential collaborators who were alarmed by the intensity of his convictions. By the early 1970s, the man who had once driven luxury cars and been a cornerstone of the London scene was living in squalor, his mind ravaged by chemicals and by beliefs that had entirely disconnected him from practical reality. He formed new bands that failed commercially. He became increasingly destitute. By 1974, he was often homeless, wandering the streets of a city he had once helped to define, carrying his saxophone case and looking for somewhere to sleep. On the 8th of May, 1974, Graham Bond fell beneath the wheels of a Piccadilly line train at Finsbury Park Station. He was 36 years old. Whether it was a catastrophic accident caused by a severely intoxicated state or a deliberate act has never been formally established. Such was the state of his existence that it took police several days to identify him, eventually relying on fingerprints. At his funeral, almost no one from the music industry attended. The men he had mentored and launched were touring the world's largest arenas. The man who had given them their start was lowered into the ground in near total obscurity. At number 4 is Rory Storm. Before the world had ever heard of John, Paul, George, and Ringo, there was one undisputed king of the Liverpool music scene. His name was Rory Storm, born Alan Caldwell. He was the golden boy of the Mirza Beat era, blonde, athletic, a natural showman whose charisma filled every room he walked into. His band, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, was the most popular group in the city. Their drummer was a young man named Richard Starkey, who would later be known to the world as Ringo Starr. In the early 1960s, it was Rory who drew the biggest crowds, not the Beatles. He was the star that every young person in Liverpool aspired to be. Then his drummer left to join a different band, and history marched on without him. Despite his immense local popularity, Rory never achieved a significant chart record. As the 1960s turned into the 1970s, the musical landscape shifted entirely. Progressive rock, glam, and the new wave had no room for an old-school rock and roll showman with spectacular stage antics and no hit singles to his name. By 1972, the man who had been the biggest act in Liverpool was working as a disc jockey and a sports instructor, living at home with his mother, Violet. The bond between Rory and his mother had become intensely close following the death of his father, codependent. By the accounts of those who knew them, their home in Liverpool, famously known among friends as Stormsville, in late September 1972, Rory developed a severe chest infection that was disrupting his sleep badly. To manage the insomnia and the general despair of stalled life, he took a combination of sleeping tablets and alcohol, a dangerous mixture consumed quietly in the small hours by a man who knew, on some level, that his best days were behind him. On the morning of the 28th of September, 1972, Rory Storm was found dead in his bed at the age of 34. When his mother, Violet, discovered the body of her son, she could not or would not conceive of a future without him. She took a lethal dose of tablets and lay down to die. When the two bodies were found later that day, the scene was described by those present as a Shakespearean tragedy. A mother and son united in death, as they had been inseparably in life. Liverpool was shaken to its foundations. Ringo Starr, then one of the most famous people on the planet, did not attend the double funeral, reportedly to spare the occasion from turning into a media event, though he sent a substantial floral tribute. We are halfway through this list, and the stories only become more consequential from here. If you're watching Golden Age Bytes for the first time, subscribe now. This is the channel that tells you what actually happened with the facts intact. Hit the bell so you never miss a new episode, and stay with us because what comes next includes the greatest drummer who ever lived and the most famous murder in the history of popular music. At number 5 is Sid James. If there was one sound that defined British cinema across the 1960s and 1970s, it was the distinctive, craggy, utterly shameless cackle of Sid James. He appeared in 19 of the 31 Carry On films, usually as a lovable rogue, sometimes as a henpecked husband, and to the public he seemed indestructible, a constant, reliable source of warmth and hilarity in a changing world. Behind the laughter was a man driven by a compulsive need to work, carrying a serious gambling addiction, and ignoring warnings that his body was in severe distress. He had already suffered a major heart attack in 1967 and had been advised in the clearest possible terms to reduce his schedule. He refused. He was too frightened that if he stopped working, the offers would cease and the debts would consume him. By April 1976, Sid was 63 years old, visibly tired, and touring the country in a stage play called The Mating Season, a schedule that would have tested a man 20 years his junior. On the night of the 26th of April, the tour reached the Sunderland Empire Theatre. He had complained of feeling unwell earlier that day, but canceling a performance was simply not something a professional of his generation did. He took the stage. The tragedy occurred during the first act. He was seated on a sofa opposite his co-star when she delivered her line and waited for his response. There was silence. His head slumped back against the cushions. His eyes closed. The audience laughed. They assumed it was a gag, a piece of inspired comic business, exactly the sort of thing Sid James would do. The laughter rippled through the packed house. People chuckled at what they perceived as genius. They were laughing at a dying man. His co-star stepped forward, realized what had happened, and broke character to call for the curtain to be brought down. The laughter stopped. An ambulance was called. Sid James had suffered a massive heart attack and passed away before he left the building. He died to the sound of applause. It was the ultimate performer's exit and the saddest possible one. Following his passing, the Carry On franchise lost its central force and slowly, irreversibly declined. Reports of his presence haunting the dressing room at the Sunderland Empire have circulated for decades, a measure of how completely he is still associated with that final stage. At number 6 is Billy Fury. In the smoke-filled dance halls of 1950s Liverpool, before the Beatles had become the Beatles, there was one man who stood as the undisputed king of British rock and roll. Billy Fury, born Ronald Wycherley, was the closest thing the United Kingdom ever produced to Elvis Presley. Chiseled, brooding, and possessed a voice that could genuinely stop a room, he spent a total of 332 weeks on the charts. His fans were devoted and numerous. Behind the golden image was a secret that cast a shadow over every single performance he ever gave. As a child, Billy had contracted rheumatic fever, which permanently damaged his heart valves. Doctors had warned him from a young age that his life expectancy would be shortened and that strenuous activity posed a real risk. He ignored the warning entirely and poured every ounce of his limited physical energy into performing, because performing was the only thing that made sense to him. By the 1970s, the physical toll became impossible to hide. He underwent 2 major open-heart surgeries during the decade, procedures that were enormously risky by the surgical standards of the era. He was forced to retire to a farm in Wales, breeding horses and watching birds, finding in quiet nature a peace that the stage had never offered him. The tragedy was not only physical. In 1978, despite being one of the most commercially successful recording artists in British history, he was declared bankrupt over unpaid taxes. He was forced to sell his possessions and return to the touring circuit, not from creative ambition, but from the simple necessity of paying his bills. A national icon with a damaged heart, performing in cabaret clubs, aware that any given performance might be his last. In the early 1980s, he attempted a final comeback. He recorded a new album. He looked sharp. He sounded strong. The hope among his fans was genuine. On the 28th of January, 1983, after a recording session, he was found unconscious at home. His heart, which had fought for 42 years against medical probability, gave out. He died in the ambulance on the way to hospital. A bronze statue of him now stands beside the Mersey in Liverpool, forever young, forever beautiful, capturing exactly the image of the boy who gave his heart to the music until there was nothing remaining to give. At number 7 is Steve Peregrine Took. In the late 1960s, Steve Peregrine Took was the other half of the psychedelic folk duo Tyrannosaurus Rex, providing the bongo rhythms and harmonies that complemented Mark Bolan's warbling, distinctive voice. They were brothers in arms, navigating London's underground hippie scene together. Then, ambition drove a wedge between them. Bolan wanted to go electric. Took wanted creative autonomy. The tension exploded during an American tour, and upon their return to England, Steve was fired. He was replaced by Mickey Finn. The band shortened its name to T. Rex and became, within months, the biggest act in Britain since the Beatles. For Steve Took, the 1970s were a decade of psychological punishment. He was forced to watch from a squalid flat in Ladbroke Grove as his former best friend appeared on Top of the Pops every other week, draped in feather boas and adored by millions. The injustice consumed him steadily. He was a genuinely talented songwriter and multi-instrumentalist, but he was branded permanently and publicly as the man who had blown his chance. He formed various bands throughout the decade, none of which gained traction. To cope with the pain of rejection and the crushing weight of being defined by what he used to be, he immersed himself in the counterculture's most dangerous excesses. When Mark Bolan died in a car crash in September 1977, Many expected Steve to feel relief, or at least the liberation of no longer being measured against his former partner. Instead, he was genuinely devastated. He had spent 10 years in Boland's shadow, but Boland had also been the only fixed point of reference in his existence. He sent royalties he had earned from their early work to support Boland's son, a final act of generosity from a destitute man. On the 27th of October, 1980, Steve Took was in a flat in North Kensington. He had consumed a combination of substances, including morphine, which had severely suppressed his gag reflex. Whilst talking and drinking, he inhaled a cocktail cherry. Because his throat was desensitized, he did not cough. He did not struggle. He suffocated in silence. He was 31 years old. The coroner recorded a verdict of death by misadventure. Steve Peregrine Took remains the patron saint of the discarded, a genuinely talented soul who could not survive the machinery of an industry that had chewed him up and quietly moved on. At number 8 is John Bonham. If the 1970s had a heartbeat, it was the thunderous right foot of John Bonham. As the drummer of Led Zeppelin, the biggest, most mysterious, and most commercially formidable band on the planet, he was not merely a musician. He was a force of nature. Known to friends and fans alike as Bonzo, he redefined the possibilities of the instrument, combining the swing of jazz with the brute physicality of heavy metal in ways that engineers, decades later, still struggled to fully explain. His isolated drum tracks, when heard without the surrounding music, produce a response in professional musicians that borders on reverence. The man behind the kit was something rather different from the rock god persona. John Bonham was a family man from the Midlands who loved building walls on his farm, breeding cattle, and being at home in Worcestershire with his wife Pat and their children, Jason and Zoe. The touring life was not something he relished. He suffered from severe anxiety before performing, a genuine, debilitating stage fright that never diminished, despite years of experience and global adulation. To manage the nerves and the grinding boredom of being away from home for months at a stretch, he turned to alcohol. What began as a coping mechanism became, by 1980, something significantly darker. Led Zeppelin was preparing for a major North American tour, their first in years. To the fans, it was an event. To John Bonham, by credible accounts, it felt like a sentence. He reportedly told friends that he had a bad feeling about leaving home, that he did not want to go. On the 24th of September, 1980, the band convened at Brace Studios for rehearsals. John's day began early at a local public house, where he started consuming strong spirits from the morning onward. His consumption continued throughout the rehearsal day. Not aggressively, not chaotically, but steadily and with purpose. The purpose of numbing a dread he could not otherwise manage. That evening, the band retired to guitarist Jimmy Page's residence at the Old Mill House in Windsor. John fell asleep on a sofa. His assistant helped him to bed and laid him on his side in a guest room. It was a routine that had happened before on other tours in other houses. This time, the silence that followed was permanent. On the afternoon of the 25th of September, when he failed to appear, his bandmate John Paul Jones and tour manager Benji Lefevre went to wake him. They found him lifeless. John Bonham was 32 years old. The official cause of death was asphyxiation. His body, overwhelmed by what the inquest estimated to be the equivalent of 40 measures of vodka consumed over a period of 12 hours, had simply shut down. Led Zeppelin's response was immediate and unambiguous. They issued a statement declaring that they could not continue without him, that the band as it existed was over. Unlike almost every other major act that had lost a key member, there was no replacement, no restructuring, no continuation. Because John Bonham was not merely their drummer. He was, in the most literal musical sense, the soul of what they were. With his death, the golden era of 1970s rock effectively ended. The airships were grounded. A man who had played like a force of nature died from a very human vulnerability, homesickness, anxiety, and a bottle of vodka in a quiet room in Windsor. At number 9 is Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers was, by wide consensus, the greatest comic actor of his generation. A man of 1,000 voices, a chameleon of absolute precision, From the bumbling Inspector Clouseau in the Pink Panther series to his 3 distinct performances in Doctor Strangelove to the eerie stillness of being there. His gift for inhabiting other people was so complete that it bordered on the supernatural. The curse embedded within that gift was one he acknowledged openly and repeatedly in interviews. He said, no personality of his own. He was a vessel, one that required the structure of a character to exist at all. When the camera stopped and the makeup came off, he was faced with a void that he spent 54 years attempting and failing to fill. His personal life in the 1970s was a sustained car crash. Broken marriages, he had 4 in total. Estranged children. Obsessive infatuations with younger women. Violent mood swings that terrified those closest to him. He had suffered a series of massive heart attacks in 1964 that left his cardiac function permanently compromised. Doctors had advised him for years to reduce stress and stop the excesses. He accelerated instead, driven by a compulsive need to acquire the next marriage, the next yacht, the next gadget, always chasing a contentment that remained precisely out of reach. Throughout the 1970s, he took on films he would otherwise have declined simply to fund a lifestyle that was itself a symptom of the emptiness he could not resolve. The film Being There, released in 1979, was, in his own estimation, the role he was born to play. A simple gardener, a blank slate onto whom the world projects its own desires. A man who is essentially nobody. Peter poured what remained of his life force into that performance and delivered a masterwork of stillness and melancholy that stands as one of the most extraordinary pieces of screen acting the British industry has ever produced. The effort left him visibly depleted. On the 22nd of July, 1980, Peter Sellers was at the Dorchester Hotel in London, a place he loved, preparing for a reunion dinner with former colleagues from the Goon Show. Shortly after lunch, his heart gave out. He was rushed to hospital and fell into a coma from which he never emerged. He passed away 2 days later at the age of 54. He left behind a legacy of laughter that has enriched millions of lives. He left behind, by his own honest account, a private life that had never once made him happy. He spent 54 years looking for a reflection in the mirror and finding nobody looking back. At number 10 is John Lennon. For our final and most significant entry, we turn to the man who was, by most credible measures, the most famous Briton of the 20th century. John Lennon was more than a musician. He was a cultural and spiritual reference point for an entire generation. A working-class boy from Liverpool who dared publicly and persistently to imagine a world built on peace rather than conflict. His journey through the 1970s was, however, far from peaceful. After the bitter and very public dissolution of the Beatles, Lennon moved to New York City, where he spent the first half of the decade fighting on 2 simultaneous fronts. Publicly, he was contesting a sustained effort by the U.S. government to deport him, driven by his vocal opposition to the Vietnam War. Privately, he was fighting his own destructive impulses during what he himself later called his Lost Weekend, an 18-month period of estrangement from Yoko Ono that saw him in Los Angeles, unmoored, drinking heavily, and living a chaotic existence alongside friends including Harry Nilsson and Keith Moon. By 1975, it appeared that John had navigated the worst of it. He reconciled with Yoko. He won his green card after a legal battle of 4 years. On his 35th birthday, his son Sean was born. And then John Lennon did something that no one who knew him in 1970 would have predicted. He stopped entirely. He retreated into the Dakota building overlooking Central Park and became, by his own description, a house husband. He baked bread, raised his son, and allowed his guitar to gather dust. He was not, for 5 years, John Lennon the Beatle. He was a father and a husband. He described this period in interviews given in the final weeks of his life as the time when he finally became a real person. As 1980 arrived, the creative instinct returned. He entered the studio to record Double Fantasy, an album that celebrated the domestic peace he had spent years searching for. He was 40 years old, healthy, sober, and by every observable measure more content than he had been in decades. He sang about starting over with genuine conviction that the second half of his life would surpass the first. On the evening of the 8th of December, 1980, John and Yoko returned to the Dakota building from a recording session. They stepped from their limousine at the archway entrance. A 25-year-old man, a former fan, fixated on a notion that John represented some form of hypocrisy, was waiting. He called out John's name. He fired a weapon multiple times at close range. Police officers drove John to Roosevelt Hospital in the back of a squad car, attempting the impossible. The announcement shortly after 11 o'clock that evening triggered a collective wave of public grief that those who witnessed it have consistently described as unlike anything before or since. The tragedy of John Lennon is not the tragedy of a star who burned out. It is not the tragedy of excess or addiction or ambition outrunning judgment. It is the tragedy of a man who had survived all of those things, who had fought his battles, healed his wounds, found genuine peace, and was ready, by every indication, to live the life he had been reaching towards for 20 years. He was 40 years old. He had just begun. A section of Central Park strawberry fields carries his memory today, marked by a mosaic bearing a single word, imagine. It is a request that grows louder with every year that passes. 10 stories, 10 careers that gave the British public some of its most enduring moments of laughter, of music, of genuine cultural connection. And in each case, behind the public brilliance, a private person fighting battles the audience never saw. The 1970s and early 1980s were a particular and unrepeatable moment in British entertainment history, a period before addiction was widely understood as a disease, before mental health was taken seriously within the industry, before the support structures that exist today had been established. These artists gave their audiences everything, in many cases quite literally everything. And the industry that profited from them gave precious little back. Their legacies endure in the laughter, in the music, in the performances that remain on record. But their deaths deserve to be understood as more than footnotes, as documented evidence of what fame at a particular moment in history could do to a person who had no protection against it. If this episode gave you something to think about, and I believe it has, then I want you to do 3 things. Subscribe to Golden Age Bytes if you have not done so already. This is the channel that tells the complete story, not the sanitized version, not the version designed to preserve reputations, but the factual, verifiable, fully documented truth. Hit the like button if this is the work you want to see more of. And leave a comment below telling me which of these 10 stories affected you most. I read every single one. These 10 people deserve to be remembered not only for how they died, but for everything they gave us whilst they lived. Until next time, this has been Golden Age Bytes, the truth about the icons.